Welcome to episode 9 of our series on business cycles. We leave the stable world of the gold standard and enter the fragile post-war era. Today, we analyze the plateau of the 20s and the emerging signs of capitalism's decadence.
This is, it's perhaps one of the most mischaracterized decades in all of modern economic history.
I was just going to say that most people hear 1920s and they immediately think the Roaring Twenties.
Exactly. Flappers, jazz, the stock market going through the roof, just one big nonstop party. But, for a structural economist looking at the deep currents, this period from 1919 to 1929, it wasn't a genuine sustained boom at all. It was a plateau.
A plateau. So high but flat, and maybe with some steep cliffs on the other side.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was a period of high but incredibly brittle activity that was masking these profound underlying instabilities.
And that's the core paradox we really need to unravel in this deep dive. How could a decade that delivered such, truly spectacular technological advances, the radio, the automobile for the masses, how could it feel so prosperous on the surface yet be so fundamentally hollow underneath? Our mission today is to understand exactly why this decade of apparent health was so structurally fragile and how it set this perfect, almost terrible stage for the world crisis of the 1930s.
And the way we unlock that is by using a really rigorous framework, the cyclical analysis from Schumpeter, specifically focusing on his theory of innovation-driven waves. We're looking at the Third Kondratieff long wave, or K3.
Okay.
And by defining what the new engine of growth was, this huge cluster of K3 innovations, we can see precisely why its expected momentum was crippled. It was crippled by these enormous global and institutional problems that the war had either created or just violently intensified.
So let's start there with that foundational framework. We need to move beyond just looking at simple GDP growth numbers and really look at the system's underlying metabolism, as you've called it, which is defined by these wave movements.
Exactly. So Schumpeter's big idea was that economic change isn't this smooth, linear process. It's disruptive, it's cyclical, and it's driven by these entrepreneurial bursts of innovation. We track 3 primary waves that are sort of nested inside each other.
Right. You've got the short ones and the really, really long ones.
You do. You have the kitchen cycle, which is the short-term inventory cycle, maybe 40 months or so. Then the juggler, that's the classic 9 to 10-year business cycle everyone talks about. And then the big one, the Kondratieff, which is this 50 to 60-year long wave of complete structural transformation.
And here's the point that I think is really counterintuitive for most people. According to this model, the 1920s weren't the start of some new big boom.
Not at all. Not even close. The third long wave, the K3, which was defined by electricity, chemistry, and the internal combustion engine, its upswing actually began way back around 1897.
So by the time we get to 1919, the cycle is already quite mature.
Very mature. The period 1919 to 1929 falls squarely within the recession and depression phases of that long wave. What that means is that the system was already structurally predisposed to painful readjustment, to intense competition, to liquidation, really the absolute opposite of an easy, sustained boom.
Wow. Okay. That reframes everything. So the Roaring Twenties was just a powerful but shorter-term juggler recovery that was just happening inside this much harsher landscape of a long-term structural decline. So the K3 engine was running, but it was, like you said, running downhill, and that was forcing efficiency rather than fueling some kind of reckless expansion.
That is the perfect description. Efficiency forced by maturity. So let's establish what this powerful engine actually was. What technologies really defined this K3 cluster?
Before we dig into the specifics, though, we have to do that fundamental vocabulary check. Innovation versus invention. People use them interchangeably, but the distinction is absolutely everything for this theory, isn't it?
It is everything. An invention is a purely technical achievement. It's the discovery made in a lab or sketched out on paper. And innovation, on the other hand, is the implementation.
It's making it real.
It's making it real. It's the irreversible, commercially successful introduction of that new idea or method into the economic process. It is the innovation, the diffusion, and the integration of the technology into the marketplace. That's what generates the massive profits, liquidates the old structures, and ultimately drives the cycle.
And by 1919, this K3 cluster was in full innovation mode. We're talking about that triumvirate that really defined the modern world: electricity, chemistry, and the automobile.
Absolutely. And, the initiating importance of electricity and chemistry is just so profound, even if the automobile tends to get all the glory.
Right. It's less flashy, but maybe more fundamental.
Way more fundamental. The availability of cheap, distributed electrical power just completely changed the possibilities of industrial organization. I mean, look at the data. U.S. power production just surged. It more than doubled, jumping from 38.9 billion kilowatt hours in 1919 to over 97 billion just 10 years later in 1929.
And a jump of that size isn't just about, turning on more lights in people's homes. What kind of specific structural implications did that exponential energy growth have for American capitalism?
It triggered a massive reorganization of capital.
Yeah.
First, it allowed for flexible factory layouts. Before electricity, you were tied to a centralized steam engine running these massive, dangerous belts.
Right, everything had to be physically connected.
Exactly. Electrification meant you could place machinery anywhere you wanted, which led to smaller, more specialized, and much, much more efficient plants. And second, it fundamentally altered geography. It was a material aid to the industrialization of the South, which now had access to abundant, cheap power without needing to be right next to the coal fields.
And that energy finally then translates into these revolutionary consumer goods that really define the decade in the public imagination.
Precisely. We see the truly spectacular expansion of these new electricity-dependent consumer durable industries, and this really takes off around 1926. Take the radio. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a revolution in communication and culture and manufacturing.
What were the numbers on that?
Radio sets in use shot up from about 250,000 to over 7 million by 1929. Similarly, household refrigeration, which ended the dependency on the Iceman and ice delivery, it soared from 315,000 units to 1.68 million. These are entirely new sectors just soaking up massive amounts of available capital and labor.
But as you said, the undisputed heavyweight champion of the K3 in the 1920s had to be the automobile.
Oh, yes. The automobile industry was the central gear. It was driving enormous subsidiary demand for petroleum, rubber, glass, steel, and critically infrastructure through road construction.
And the employment numbers must have been staggering.
They tell part of the story, yeah. Auto manufacturing employment itself went from about 253,000 in 1922 to over 427,000 by 1929. And the number of passenger vehicles registered just rose steadily year after year, even through the little recessions.
Now, this all sounds like a booming sector, a classic boom. But you're pointing out that even within the automotive industry itself, the progress was defined by maturity rather than, say, nascent growth.
That's the key K3 decline phase dynamic. You see, by the 1920s, the basic invention of the car was long since complete. The real focus had shifted from radical novelty to intense rationalization and standardization. Henry Ford's methods, Taylorization scientific management, they were being applied aggressively everywhere.
So it's about making them cheaper and more efficiently.
Cheaper, lighter, smaller. The trend was all about cost cutting. This means the competitive pressure was just enormous.
So if your output is increasing that rapidly, but your whole focus is on standardization and squeezing costs, what does that do to the profit structure of the industry?
Profit per unit begins to decline steadily. The industry matures with incredible speed, evolving from that early chaotic phase of competitive capitalism where you had dozens of manufacturers toward a very tight competitive oligopoly dominated by the big three.
So that pressure to reduce costs, to standardize every process, that's the hallmark of a Kondratieff downswing. The system is being forced to adapt to the new innovation rather than just effortlessly profiting from it.
You've got it. The overall economic progress wasn't being driven by pioneering entirely new fields, but by what Schumpeter calls the induced and consummtive development of pre-war ideas. It's efficiency and saturation, which is structurally weakening, rather than radical, expensive new investment, which is structurally strengthening.
And that leads us perfectly into this idea of the superficial strength that was masking all this underlying weakness.
Precisely. The K3 engine was powerful, no doubt about it, but the track it was running on was brittle and scarred by global war and just a mountain of debt.
Let's start with the immediate aftermath of the war, that period from 1918 to 1922. Now, the war itself was an outside factor. It violently interrupted the natural cycle of business. But there was a crisis right after, in 1920 or 1921. It was very severe, but also surprisingly brief.
It was a classic sharp liquidation. The 1920-1921 crisis was primarily the economic system purging itself of all the excesses that had been created by wartime production and that immediate overheated post-war boom of 1919.
Okay, so why was it so brief? What made it so effective compared to what came later?
The speed of the contraction. Prices and wages fell drastically, and they fell fast.
And why does that speed matter so much here?
Because rapid liquidation clears the system's arteries. When prices and costs fall quickly, all the misallocated resources, the inefficient wartime factories, the excess inventories, they get wiped out and revalued almost immediately. This allowed this system to clear the ground and stabilize with remarkable speed by April 1921.
Which is a sharp contrast to the prolonged grinding depressions that came later, where you see more political interference trying to slow down those necessary price and wage adjustments.
Exactly. The system took its medicine quickly and got back on its feet.
So once that quick purge was done, the system appeared stable. What was the major economic booster that then created this illusion of sustained, robust prosperity for the rest of the decade?
Without a single question, it was the construction boom. It was absolutely gigantic, and it functioned as this temporary fix that provided massive employment and financial activity. It was, in fact, the largest single contributor to the post-war business volume.
And this emphasis on construction, on building infrastructure, housing, skyscrapers, that's structurally significant within this K3 decline model, right?
Highly significant. We often see massive construction activity during the decline phase of a Kondratieff cycle. For example, during the K2 decline phase in the late 19th century, say 1878 to 1894, construction also played this outsized role in sustaining activity.
And why is that? What does it represent?
It represents investment that isn't fundamentally driven by new, radical, K-wave innovation. It's driven more by demographic pressures and sort of catching up on necessary infrastructure that was neglected before.
So what were the specific factors that were fueling this enormous building spree in the 1920s?
You have three things all converging at once. First, wartime omission. Non-essential construction basically stopped entirely during World War I, and that created this huge pent-up demand.
Right.
Second, massive demographic shifts. You saw huge internal migration patterns combined with a significant population increase of about 15 million people between 1920 and 1929. People just needed places to live, to work, and to shop.
And the third factor?
The K3 efficiencies themselves. They raised real per capita income, which allowed people across all strata of society to demand better housing in larger cities.
The scale of that is really hard to conceptualize. How much investment are we actually talking about here?
New, non-farm residential construction. And that includes speculative high-rises, hotels, clubs. It reached an estimated $34 billion for the decade. Just think of the skyline changes in New York and Chicago during that era. It was incredible.
And to support that, the financing structures had to inflate just as dramatically.
They did. Urban mortgages nearly doubled, soaring from approximately $13 billion in 1922 to $27 billion by 1929.
So we have this huge investment driven by real demographic demand, but, and this seems crucial, it's being heavily amplified by credit.
Yes. And this is where the structural weakness really starts to appear. The boom was accelerated by easy credit and a cheap money policy. The system was just awash in liquidity. And this illustrates a critical economic point. Cheap money doesn't always flow evenly into productive, future-proof industrial investment.
It finds other places to go.
It finds the path of least resistance, which is often into specific speculative sectors that promise high immediate returns. In this case, that meant urban mortgage bonds and heavily leveraged real estate development.
And this channeling of funds led to what the source material calls a gigantic misapplication of capital resources during those Coolidge-Hoover boom years. What exactly defines a misapplication of capital in this context?
It means that the investment was based on flawed long-term anticipation. Capital that's invested in fixed resources, say a 50-story skyscraper or a massive suburban subdivision, it relies on these really optimistic assumptions that future rents, future profits, and future population growth will justify the huge debt you're incurring today.
So the whole financial structure was built on a belief in permanent prosperity.
An entire financial structure, especially the complex issuance of mortgage bonds to fund all this, was built on the belief that the 1920s prosperity was permanent and that the rapid pace of growth and urbanization would just continue indefinitely.
And of course, when those long-term anticipations started to fail, the entire financial scaffolding built on top of those optimistic expectations became incredibly unstable. The fragility was just baked right into the long-term investment structure from the very beginning.
Precisely. The construction boom provided the illusion of depth, but it was highly speculative and just incredibly susceptible to the slightest reversal in confidence or tightening of credit.
So we've got a powerful but maturing K3 engine, we have a quick post-war liquidation, and then this temporary debt-fueled construction boost. But underneath all of that, the deep-seated structural fragility was mounting. Which brings us to Section 4, structural malaise. This is where we see the real rot setting in, starting with the long agrarian depression.
Agrarian distress is, sadly, pretty common during Kondratieff decline phases, But the situation in the 1920s was made uniquely poisonous by the overhang of wartime finance.
How so?
During the war boom, prices for crops were high and farmers borrowed massively. But often it was for non-productive uses like speculative land purchases, all based on the assumption that those prices would stay inflated forever.
Can we put some numbers on that debt explosion?
We can. Agricultural mortgage debt just exploded from $3.3 billion in 1910 to a peak of $9.46 billion by 1928. And again, this debt was used to purchase land at inflated wartime prices, often at the exact moment that new technology was arriving that would make that very same land less valuable.
So that massive debt load collided head-on with the K3 efficiency we were talking about earlier. Technology was supposed to help the farmer, but instead it just became this competitive weapon.
It was brutal. Technological innovation, the widespread adoption of tractors, combines, new fertilizers, often powered by K3 electricity, it lowered production costs dramatically for the farmers who could afford the investment. But this meant that overall supply surged, which drove prices down globally. This efficiency, while it was a technical marvel, displaced vast areas and populations.
In purely economic terms, this migration from farm to industry was a normal adaptation. But what was the human cost and the competitive result on the ground?
The human cost was the ruin of millions of small farmers, which led to massive internal migration and social upheaval. And the competitive result was the annihilation of older, less mechanized farming regions. You can look at the specific example of cotton.
Okay.
The expansion of mechanized, highly efficient dryland farming in states like Texas and Oklahoma competitively decimated the more traditional, labor-intensive cotton cultivation of the Southeast.
So the regions where efficiency could be most easily adopted thrived, while the established regions with these huge debt loads were forced below the margin of profitable production, making their wartime debt completely unserviceable. The K3's efficiency was literally liquidating entire regional economies.
Precisely. The market was correcting the wartime excesses, but it was a correction administered with a technologically advanced hammer.
And this structural weakness wasn't just confined to American fields, it was rampant internationally, specifically tied to those unresolved political payments, the reparations and inter-allied debts left over from the war.
This unresolved international friction was maybe the single most destabilizing global factor of the decade. The whole system of political payments, Germany paying reparations, the Allied countries paying war debts to the U.S., it was designed to be self-defeating. They were never solved, frankly, which means no country was willing to accept the necessary write-offs or structural changes that were required to make the system sustainable.
So how did the global economy manage to pretend the system was functional for most of the 1920s? What was holding it all together?
It was masked by the massive outflow of American capital. The U.S. had become the world's preeminent creditor, and American capital exports, reaching up to $5 billion by the end of the decade, acted as this huge circulatory mechanism.
Can you walk us through how that worked?
Sure. American banks would lend money to Germany, often through things like the Dawes and Young plans. Germany would then use that money to pay reparations to France and Britain. And then France and Britain would use those payments to service their own inter-allied debts back to the U.S. Treasury.
It sounds like a giant, unstable financial merry-go-round, funded entirely by new American credit.
It was Ponzi finance on a global scale. This liquidity, it counteracted the disturbance that the political payments should have created, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. It just postponed the day of reckoning for when U.S. lending would inevitably slow down.
And compounding all of this was the famous American resistance to fully embracing its new creditor position, which was exemplified by protectionism. The Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act of 1922 is often cited as the big villain here.
The U.S. was very reluctant to accept the fundamental logic of being a world creditor, which is you have to allow your debtors to pay you back in goods and services, not just in gold or borrowed cash.
But were the high tariffs really the cause of the problem?
It's complex. Economic historians argue they were less of a cyclical cause of the instability and more of a reaction to the dislocations that were already present, specifically the instability caused by unequal currency stabilization and the fear of foreign competition.
So protectionism wasn't the spark that lit the fire, but it acted as this heavy, non-flammable material that prevented any necessary structural adjustment when the fire finally broke out.
That's a great way to put it. It prevented the necessary international adjustments that might have cleared the system. The refusal to accept its creditor position meant the U.S. insisted on both high debt payments and high barriers to trade, which is a structural contradiction that just guaranteed fragility.
Let's shift to the final and maybe the most fascinating aspect of this structural malaise. The sociological changes. The sources use this term, the erosion of capitalist attitudes, or even the decadence. This goes way beyond numbers and balance sheets.
This is where we see the capitalist process, really through its own success, subtly undermining the very institutional framework that's necessary for its own sustained dynamism. It's a profound sociological change.
What were the clearest signs of this institutional erosion in the 1920s?
Well, first, you have the shifting political balance. Capitalism's success fueled the rise of politically influential labor interests, but maybe more importantly, the spectacular growth of the salaried, white-collar class, the new middle class.
The managers, the bureaucrats.
Exactly. This class, which is reliant on stable salaries rather than entrepreneurial profit, grew in political friction and often expressed this kind of anti-bourgeois hostility. They benefited from the system, but they weren't personally invested in the dynamic risk-taking that actually drove it.
So the very structure that traditionally supported the high-risk, high-reward entrepreneur was being diluted by this new risk-averse managerial class.
Precisely. The shift is from Schumpeter's creative destruction, which is driven by the bold, long-term entrepreneur, to a more bureaucratic management style focused on consolidation and stability, which is a hallmark of the late stages of a K-wave.
And this societal change seems to have affected the core motivation of the traditional capitalist, the idea of the anti-saving mentality.
This is absolutely critical. The traditional bourgeois motivation, that desire to save diligently, often sacrificially, for the indefinite dynastic future of one's family, it began to erode profoundly. The 1920s saw public policy and increasingly popular literature and advertising adopt an anti-saving attitude. It emphasized immediate consumption and a short-term focus.
Saving for a distant, maybe unattainable future seemed less appealing than enjoying all these new K3 consumer products right now.
Exactly. Why wait?
So when that driving motive changes from long-term dynastic wealth creation to short-term stability and consumption, how does that manifest itself in policy?
It manifests primarily through fiscal policy interference. The imposition of a highly progressive income tax, exceeding 25% on higher income groups, coupled with heavy corporate and inheritance taxes, acts as a systemic interference with the capitalist engine.
And how specifically does high progressive taxation interfere with that Schumpeterian engine of innovation?
It blunts the profit motive that's tied to that long-term family position ambition. If the government is going to take a large percentage of your profits and then also heavily tax the inheritance of what's left, the incentive for a capitalist to undertake the massive, decades-long, risky investments that define true K-wave innovation is significantly reduced.
Why risk everything for a marginal net gain, especially when a stable bureaucratic career is rewarded?
Exactly. This systematically decreases the total national saving that's available for truly risky, transformative investment.
So this sounds like the economic system, already weakened by the structural demands of the K3 decline, was also being attacked from within by policy and these social shifts, making it incapable of the kind of self-correction or bold new investment needed to get off the plateau.
It was a compounding fragility. The very mechanism of wealth creation was slowing down due to institutional friction, and that made the system incredibly susceptible to any external shock.
Which brings us perfectly to the spectacular finale that everyone remembers, the stock market crash. Where did the boom of 1928, 1929, and the subsequent market collapse fit into this rigorous cyclical model?
The strong activity you see from about 1925 to 1929 was just a powerful juggler recovery phase. Remember, the juggler is that shorter 9 to 10-year cycle. This shorter recovery was unfolding within the context of the much larger, decades-long Kondratieff depression phase.
So it was an interference pattern, giving a temporary high during a period of structural low.
That's it. And the final period of market frenzy in 1928 and 1929 was amplified by what we term the secondary waves.
For secondary waves.
Correct. The final boom was amplified far beyond what the underlying industrial base could possibly sustain by what we call autonomous monetary factors, that easy credit we discussed, and just sheer speculative mania. The secondary waves are phenomena like psychological error, overoptimism, speculation. They intensify the amplitude of the underlying primary cycle, but they don't determine its direction.
And it is absolutely vital to stress this point, because popular history so often gets us completely backward. Stock market speculation and that new era mentality were not the fundamental cause of the approaching economic downturn.
They were the fever, not the disease. The speculative excess was just an amplifier. Think of it this way. Just as the rise of speculation needed a fundamental cause, which was the massive credit-fueled investment opportunities in new K3 industries and construction, The subsequent downfall of that speculation required a more fundamental explanation than the speculative excess itself.
The mania just ensured that when the system finally broke, the pain would be maximized.
Yes.
What were some of the underlying economic tensions that were signaling the structural weakening even as the stock market was soaring to new heights?
Even amid the record production numbers in 28 and 29, the signs of strain were everywhere if you knew where to look. Unemployment was actually rising even before the crash. Also, businesses needed these desperate selling efforts because commodity prices were inelastic, which meant the market couldn't easily absorb the high output at current prices. It indicated saturation and strain.
So the fundamental cause of the eventual breakdown was the slackening down of those massive construction and durable equipment industries, coupled with the increasing difficulty businesses faced in calculating costs and returns in a rapidly maturing competitive market.
That's it. The engine was just running out of steam at the structural level. The construction boom had peaked, and the speculative credit that was supporting it was about to evaporate.
The stock market crash of October 1929 was therefore the dramatic first financial event. It was the signal, much like the breakdown of speculative bubbles in 1873 and 1907.
It was purely the signal. And what's fascinating is that the initial business reactions were actually quite mild. Most leaders, they were still clinging to that juggler recovery mindset, and they fully expected a recovery by 1930. They entirely failed to grasp the fatal misunderstanding.
Which was what?
They believed the fundamental data, the high production, the high employment figures from the recent past, was solid.
But that data was, as the source says, in a state of flux, about to be submerged by the torrents of structural readjustment.
Exactly. The necessary brutal liquidation that was demanded by the K3 decline phase. Clearing out all that excess industrial capacity, purging the mountain of unproductive agricultural debt, dismantling the inflated asset values in construction and utility finance, that was finally about to begin in earnest.
And the collapse of credit, which was built upon those volatile, optimistic foundations, just ensured the ensuing contraction would be not just a recession, but an extraordinary global depression. What we are left with, then, is a decade that looked vibrant on the surface, but whose growth was based on efficiency and credit expansion rather than deep, pioneering K3 investment. It was a structural high-wire act, made inherently unstable by unresolved war debts, an agrarian crisis, and the gradual erosion of the capitalist entrepreneurial spirit.
The 1920s really stand as a powerful demonstration. It shows that even with breakthrough technology and massive potential for growth, knowledge of economic mechanics alone is insufficient. Political and institutional factors, the refusal to liquidate debt, frankly, the interference of taxation with entrepreneurial incentive, they can fundamentally frustrate the system's ability to self-correct and liquidize excess capacity, which then leads to a much more severe eventual collapse. The decade was defined by a strong juggler recovery that simply couldn't withstand the deep-seated long-term pressures of the Kondratieff downswing.
The stock market crash was not the cause, but the signal. In our final episode, episode 10, we will analyze the world crisis and its aftermath, 1930 and 1935, from chapter 9, concluding with Schumpeter's definitive critique of the new Keynesian macroeconomics.